Hello, everyone, and welcome back. If you're just logging on, thank you for joining the Climate and Resiliency Risk Workshop hosted by NOAA and Liberty Mutual. I'm Raki Kumar from Liberty Mutual, and I'd like to introduce our next panel that's titled Community Impacts of Climate Change. Are local government finances ready for what is coming? Today's discussion will take a unique look at climate resiliency and risk to local communities with panelists from academia, the investment and insurance industries, and the public sector. As a quick reminder, we'll have a short Q&A after the panel discussion, so please feel free to submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to the questions in the time permitted. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Pamela Williams, Executive Director of Build Strong Coalition. Build Strong Coalition is doing some great work advocating to build a more resilient America, and I'm excited about the industry perspective that they bring to this discussion. Pam, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so very much, Rocky. And again, thanks to Liberty Mutual and our friends at NOAA for pulling together this amazing conversation. I am so excited during this panel where we're going to talk about community impacts and our communities really going to have the financial resources to be able to build their resilience. And we're going to build on the last panel's conversation. And I have some tremendous folks here that are going to join me in this conversation. Let me do a quick introduction of them. I've got Emily Robert, who's head of ESG for municipal bonds at PEMCO. I've got Dr. Kuski, who's the executive director of the Wharton Risk Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Mark Osler, who's the NOAA Senior Advisor for Coastal Inundation and Resilience, and is talking about resilience being discussed across the entire NOAA enterprise. And then Serena Sowers, who's the Vice President of the Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re. I'm really excited to bring together both the financial sector and particularly the insurance sector to really build on what we heard about first thing during this workshop, when Deputy Secretary Graves said that we are now facing the greatest level of investment in not only coastal inundation and wildfire monitoring, but truly updating flood maps and really from the federal perspective, tackling some of those challenges that are facing our communities with identifying risk. So I'm really excited to get this conversation underway, and I'm looking forward to the questions that those of you who are joining us virtually will be able to submit, and we'll dedicate the last minutes of this conversation to trying to tackle some of those. So let's get this conversation started. So Mark, I am going to start with you because we just heard an amazing panel conversation about not only the resources, but the data, and I guess the priority that we heard this morning that NOAA is placing on the tools that you can put in the hands, not only of the private sector, but also state and local governments to make wise decisions about the risk that they are facing. So I'm very curious, how do we help communities identify the needs and of the potential impacts? How do we communicate better about that? Because we can no longer talk about things in terms of like the 100-year floodplain and people only think, oh, it's only going to happen once every 100 years. How do we put that in a format that people can digest, make it usable and very tactical? And I'd love to hear about NOAA's role and objectives in providing that information both to the public and private sectors. Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Pam. It's really a pleasure to join the other panelists here on this discussion. And I just want to celebrate the framing of this discussion. Most of the time we would have spent a fair amount of our fuel already as a group talking about is climate changing. And I appreciate that we're not spending a lot of time there and we're shifting that discussion in terms of a practical application of, well, what does this mean? And that small change in framing I'll count as an important indicator of our progress here as a community writ large. Thinking about the question of what do communities need, I'd like to just approach this by talking briefly about flooding specifically, but we could just as well use drought or heat or any environmental variable of interest. But to use flooding as an example, communities are asking basic questions like, when will it flood? Where will it flood? How deep will the water be? How long will this event occur? And then beyond specific events, folks want to know how frequently events like this will occur. If what we're seeing in this past few years or decades is different in some way from what has happened in the past? And ultimately, what are the impacts to me, my area of interest, and how will each of these factors be different in the future than they are now? How do I use this information along with social and economic data to analyze decisions for my community, which are financially, socially, ecologically, and politically viable? And so these are the nature of the questions that NOAA gets asked a lot. And from this, we can discern that our nation is hungry for additional actionable, comprehensive, and authoritative climate information available across all U.S. states and territories and needed to sustain and grow their economies and livelihoods, as well as add more detailed measurements, modeling, maps, and tools which convey both current and future risk. And so NOAA and the federal science enterprise more broadly play a vital role in meeting these needs. Every component of the U.S. economy, both public and private sector, that are looking to understand the impacts of climate change on their mission, start first with NOAA data. Or if they don't, at least their consultants do. And folks don't only look at NOAA data, of course. There are myriad and vital contributions from across the federal science enterprise, academia, and the private sector. But NOAA's role is unique in providing the nation's authoritative record of how our environment has been changing and statements about how it is likely to change in the future. Now, there are federal mandates to conduct climate-related measurements and modeling that could run down the length of your arm. But we're well aware that just more and better data in and of itself is not enough to enable new models of success on the ground. Acknowledging the critical role that measurements, research, and modeling of climate change takes, NOAA's mission itself is broader than just the pure science. NOAA's mandate is to produce and communicate climate science, but also to produce authoritative forecasts and predictions of environmental change, and also to ensure that this science is translated, understood by, and useful to stakeholders on the ground, and also to directly serve as managers and stewards for our natural trust and living marine resources. NOAA's three-part mandate then of science, service, and stewardship is really unique and serves as a powerful force multiplier for NOAA's contributions in the climate space. We are not only climate science experts, but also bring decades worth of wisdom and understanding in tackling the impacts of risks associated with climate change on the ground. And so from these mandates, NOAA serves as a convening partner for climate science and services across the federal government, and through discussions like this, to work directly with the financial community to ensure that climate science and services produced by NOAA and the federal science enterprise more broadly are well targeted to meet the needs of the financial community. Can't talk about climate impacts to communities without touching real briefly on resilience, which is an important concept in all of these discussions. And I offer that we could define resilience as the ability to prepare for, absorb, recover from, and successfully adapt to change. This change could be physical or ecological or chemical, biological. It can relate from impacts from specific events like storms or harmful algal blooms, as well as impacts from increased baseline stress from ongoing change through variables like ocean warming or sea level rise. And so it's important to highlight that resilience itself is an outcome. It is not a product. The federal government cannot create resilience and deliver it to stakeholders. However, NOAA's authoritative data and services which communicate how our environment is changing over time is an important component of the nation's scientific lifeblood that enables risk-informed decision-making. If there's a single insight from these decades of work, it is that all resilience is local. Resilience is built upon a combination of authoritative science and sustained high-touch partnerships. The federal government is in a good position to coordinate and convene, but depends critically on partnerships across academia, nonprofits, public sector, and the private sector to help organizations and communities adapt to and respond to climate threats. And I'll wrap up by reiterating the important role that the private sector has to play in all steps in this process. As partners in the technology and research involved with measuring and modeling climate change, as partners in the communication of climate science within the financial sector, and as a voice from within the private sector to partner with NOAA in shaping the creation of new science and services. From these mandates and in partnership with the private sector and others, NOAA has an opportunity to both produce new climate projections designed to support financial risk management, as well as expand capabilities for climate information equity through interfaces designed to provide analysis and standardized climate information. So with all that as an overview, I would say that NOAA is indeed, Pam, as you noted, very seriously focused on both advancing the skill of what we currently produce in terms of services and insights about future conditions, but also critically to do audits of equitable access and alignment of our services to make sure they are serving our whole nation. And lastly, and most simply perhaps, to fill in existing geographic gaps to make sure that folks in Shaktoolik, Alaska have the same suite of information free of cost and same authoritative skill as the folks in Boston and Miami and San Francisco. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Wow, thank you, Mark. And thank you so much for centering us back on the true definition of resilience as we're having this discussion, because I have noted in so many different communities, the definition is different. So now that we know what we're all talking about, and thank you so much for your acknowledgement of the fundamental level that most communities are at. I go into communities and literally they don't even know how to start the conversation, let alone do they have any awareness of the risks that their community is actually facing. So I love that you highlighted and perfectly set up the next question. Key is partnerships and creative relationships with the private sector. So Serena, I'm going to turn it over to you because obviously the insurance sector is a tremendous risk advisor, brings a tremendous amount of data to the table, partners tremendously with NOAA. How can the private sector and the insurance industry really come to the table with the tools that they have, partnering with NOAA ultimately, because aren't we trying to drive better decision-making, better investments to ultimately increase true resilience in these communities? Serena, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Pam, and thank you all for having me. And I'm really excited to be on a panel with such great thinkers. So really what I have to share is the opposite side of the coin that Mark just shared and how we think about some of these same questions from the private sector standpoint. And to take a step back, the role Swiss Re plays as a reinsurer. For the past many decades, we've been tracking the trends that we see across sectors, trends that we see across regions, and what the impact of climate change has been globally and what it means for global GDP as well as the regional GDP, the global biodiversity and the local impacts on diversity, diversity shifts when you see the climate change impacts escalating, right? So we've been tracking and really understanding that impact to our sector. And for us, there are a couple of things that are really important with the type of research we've done, with the type of information that we've been able to leverage from the public sector to better understand the risks. And in the very immediate sense, we have shifted how we do our business. We have really prioritized our operations to align with the priorities that we have when it comes to the kind of shifts that we want to see in the industry. Our operations are aligned, the way we underwrite is aligned, and where we want to see the industry headed, we also know that we have an influence there. So with that in mind, I think the holistic questions that we believe that are important to ask, not just as insurers, but together as the public sector, the private sector, the academia coming together, we've really been probing into a few specific things, which is how can we price risk in a way that helps influence societies and communities and governments think about adaptation and mitigation in a more holistic way. So can the pricing of risk itself influence that conversation? And can we write our business, right, the insurance business in a way that drives the net zero goals, as well as influences that behavior change? And also, how can we work with governments to really get at the heart of the issue when it comes to reaching communities and reaching hard to reach populations and individuals who are most impacted by climate change? And are there solutions that we can provide that addresses these needs? And that really is at the heart of the resilience conversation that we are having for us, and figuring out what we can do to influence that discussion. And this is where we believe that insurance, when it's done well, can do three things critically. And for us, one is, of course, what we are most familiar with insurance doing, which is providing that critical safety net for individuals and communities to recover from after a shock or a stress, after a catastrophic event of some sort. And this is where we lean on insurance the most. But we also believe that there's two critical roles other roles that insurance can play. One is pricing the risk accurately, with the kind of conversations that we've had with the first panel around really understanding where we are headed as a society, where we are headed together when it comes to the climate change impacts, pricing it as a way so that the community can understand what the cost of inaction is, what the cost of mitigation looks like in comparison. So the decision around when to mitigate, when to adapt, when to self-insure, and when to transfer risk can be made from that place of understanding. And the final is that value is around behavior change. And here, I really think it's important for us to understand that along with pricing and along with indicating where the insurance industry can and cannot play, there's an inherent way of indicating where we need to jointly make decisions around how we want to function together as a society. That pricing of risk also goes hand in hand with that behavioral change of how we choose to make certain decisions together as a society. And this is where I really think governments coming together, along with academics, along with researchers, is so critical in figuring out how we can use that influence around the pricing of risk, understanding of risk, to jointly inform each other of those type of decisions that we need to make together. I'll end by saying this. I think what's critically clear when it comes to the climate change impacts is some populations are much more impacted by it than others. And I think one of the panelists mentioned this in the last panel, that the long-term costs are paid at, a cost of climate change is paid at the local level, paid by individuals, paid by taxpayers. So when we think about climate resilience in the long run, we really need to keep that in mind. This is not free money that comes from federal government. This is money that's paid by the individual that costs a lot to get back to rebuild a community. And when it comes to long-term recovery, when we think of the type of financial tools that we have in place, we really have to think about the long-term costs of building and recovery, and figuring out how we can tap into the private sector solutions that are out there. So with that, Pam, let me hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Serena. So I think this really brings us to the next big question. And Dr. Kuski, I'd really like to turn to you, because the Wharton Risk Center does such phenomenal work in this area. So how do we account for climate risk? How do we make sure that communities have the information and the data that they need, that they're aware of the actual risk, the potential increases in costs and losses, so that they are truly prioritizing risk, making better decisions around that risk? And I know that you've done a lot of work in that area, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Wonderful questions. And it's so great to be here chatting with all of you today. I think we're just starting to grapple with the myriad ways in which climate changes are going to impose fiscal costs on local governments. Some of that thinking, I think, has come from the municipal bond market. I know we're going to hear more about that in a few minutes. It's also being propelled by the advances we're seeing in climate risk modeling and analysis that we just heard about, and frankly, just the growing number of climate-related disasters that communities around the country are facing. As we heard in the first panel, while there are still uncertainties, we're getting better ideas all the time of impacts at a regional and local level. And we have some good ideas of trends that can be useful guideposts, I think, for decision makers at the local level about the types of impacts they might experience and the adaptation measures that they might need to invest in. But I think we're only in the early stages of really getting a sort of more detailed and nuanced picture of the fiscal impacts of climate change on local governments. we know enough to say that the impacts, I think, could be much more diverse and wide-ranging than an initial cursory thought might suggest. That is to say, I think it's going to go substantially beyond property damage and infrastructure disruption. A colleague and I have a forthcoming paper where we tried to tackle this by looking historically at how wildfires in California impacted the budgets of municipalities. And I should say our data stopped in 2015. So we were looking at, you could think of this as more modest wildfires, not the very extreme fires that the state has seen in the last few years. And still, we found that overall budget impacts were decidedly negative, and that there were impacts from wildfires on both expenditures and on revenues. Local spending on community development and public safety increased as part of recovery, but sales tax revenues also went up temporarily, probably due to reconstruction. And I think an interesting point too was that we found that property taxes went up, but this is because of a unique law in California that freezes property assessments until time of sale. And so lots of properties are sort of radically underpaying, sort of radically undervalued until they're sold. And the high turnover in properties after the fire led to these reassessments. And I think that's important, not to get into the weeds of California, but because it stresses that fiscal impacts are mediated by state laws and institutional contexts that are going to vary a lot, right? And that often might on the surface not seem to have a lot to do with climate risk. But we're going to have to think about those heterogeneity across locations. And so I think historical studies like this can provide some measure of how climate disasters can disrupt budgets, but we'll need more of them to get at those differences by type of event, by fiscal condition, by how vulnerable different sources of revenue and expenditures are to different types of stresses and impacts. Two colleagues and I are actually working on trying to put together a framework for all these pathways right now. I want to say, though, that there's limits to looking at historical data, right? Which is why the climate impacts has been focused on these models that we were hearing about to look forward. And it comes to the impacts in terms of fiscal impacts as well. So we're moving right far outside of historical experience, and we're going to start seeing more and more events like the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, the ice storm in Texas, these types of events that might not have good historical analogs. And so we need to be thinking about that type of modeling from an economic and fiscal perspective, as well as the climate perspective as well. And I think when you start to do that, you'll see that the pathways, as I was mentioning, between the kind of climate impacts and local financial impacts could be really varied. So it's not just the immediate costs of climate extremes, which of course are large and growing, things like emergency response spending, debris cleanup, repairing infrastructure and buildings. And it's not just the need to invest in new defensive infrastructure, which of course we have to do in communities across the country, upgrading stormwater systems, new flood control investments, whether that's green or gray, building retrofits, relocations, and so on. But it's also going to be things like the impacts of nuisance flooding that drive down property values that lead to lower tax revenues, or the higher frequency of heat waves and water stress in the Southwest leading to migration out of the Sun Belt, or widespread business interruption driving down sales and income tax receipts. And so I think getting a better handle on all these pathways is going to be important. And while some municipalities have started making investments in building climate resilience at a financial level, many have not. And I think one challenge that you mentioned is that risks are often not in the bottom line. It's sort of an accounting problem. We don't track liabilities from climate risks. And if we don't track the liabilities, then expenditures on reducing risk look just like costs, because we're not seeing the benefits in terms of reduced damage in the future. And that can be a disincentive to spend money on risk reduction. So I think we need to start thinking about how to incorporate climate risk into all municipal investments and capital budgeting and planning. Some cities are taking sort of leading steps in this direction. I'll just call out Pittsburgh because we did a nice Q&A with them on their blog talking about how they're being really forward thinking in terms of what climate friendly budgeting looks like. But I also want to note, and this has come up a few times, that risk reduction measures to lower the cost of climate impacts can themselves be really costly. And some localities simply don't have a lot of extra funds to put toward these needed investments. And of course, there's different sources of federal funds that can help support investments in adaptation and hazard mitigation. There's been instances of states helping localities that face severe fiscal stress after a disaster. For example, I'm thinking about Paradise in California, and after their wildfire, some state stepping in helped stabilize their bond ratings. But a lot of assistance doesn't fill all the gaps that they might see in revenue. So I'll just wrap up by noting, and maybe connecting to some of Serena's thoughts, there have been a few public entities that are starting to think about the role that insurance can play here. For example, parametric insurance products are those that can pay this set amount based on a measure of the hazard and provide fast and flexible dollars to localities that face these shocks in either revenues or expenditures. Federal support, we know, is not always available. And when it is, it can take a really long time to get to local governments. And so insurance might fill that gap. So I'll just maybe totally end now by noting one last point that occurs to me is that the private sector has also, again, as Serena can talk about, been moving forward on a range of tools to manage climate risks. And we're now thinking about how you can apply some of these to the public sector, right? So things like climate disclosures and reporting and stress testing, and what does that mean for municipalities, I think is a really good avenue of future work. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Pam. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Well, and I think you have absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's where are we going to get the resources to make a lot of these investments, and how can these investments be creatively leveraged together? So Emily, I'd like to turn it over to you, because I think we really need to understand what creative solutions may be on the table, what risk is looking like for municipal finance, and how risk is being considered, maybe where we need, as a resilience community, need to be driving that conversation, because ultimately action usually follows the money. So how can we get more resources and more creative financial solutions on the ground in these communities that are ready to invest in resilience? Emily?
Great, thanks, Pam. Well, I'll just kind of address the risk side of things and what we're looking at right now with municipal finance and risk. And so I'm a municipal credit analyst. I look at municipal bonds every day and decide, to analyze them and decide what ones would be good to buy or good to hold on to. And so climate risk is something I would say, just particularly in the last few years, to Mark's point early on, where we used to have this debate about, is climate change real? Now it's just very much a factor that's part of everyday life. And looking at municipal bonds, I think for us, and we're not alone in doing that. The rating agencies, we're seeing, especially in the last couple of years, all of the major public credit rating agencies incorporate, to some degree, some are doing it better than others, but to incorporate climate risk into their ratings and into their discussions. And to a lot of the points that Dr. Kuski was talking about, of the risks that you're seeing and you're thinking about, is what's the impact on tax base? Are people going to leave? What's going to affect population? Are we seeing an increase in leverage? So these are things that we're thinking about, any coastal community or a wildfire-prone community that we look at, thinking about how this is going to impact the ability and willingness to repay that debt back. As far as financing options, to your question, municipal bonds, I think, are one of the largest finance options that's out there for communities. But because of this, that we are now starting to think about this more in those analyses, it could, over time, we're not seeing it yet, but it could impact the interest rates that those communities are paying on their debt. People always ask the question, are you seeing this affecting pricing right now? And I would say not a lot is affecting pricing right now. There's a lot of demand out there for municipal bonds. And so even traditional credit factors don't always lead to a lot of spread differential in what people are willing to pay. But where I do see it coming into play is, so for example, if we're looking at something in our credit ratings, we are absolutely including climate risk. And so when you have different strategies that are thinking about where people may have a lower appetite for risk, then you're not seeing some of these bonds that have higher levels of climate risk, particular wildfire risk, being put into those strategies. So you might start to see some of these bonds move into places where there's a growing tolerance for some of these risks. And so then it starts to get to, I think, some of the other, federal government, or if there's other options that are out there, if you're thinking about financing for some of these projects. But municipal bonds is certainly one of the larger strategies out there. Financing options out there. One other thing I would say about bonds and where this comes into an issue is not just about pricing, but liquidity. And so where you may not see it being included, when you're a buyer of a bond, you might want to be selling that bond at some point. And the types of risks that we're talking about, some of these can materialize overnight, particularly if you have a wildfire. And so we saw this happen a lot last spring, April 2020. If you were a holder of bonds backed by hotel tax revenues, there probably were not a lot of people that wanted to buy those bonds from you. And we saw liquidity dry up in certain segments of the municipal market and other, parts of the financial markets. And so there's definitely that thought as well of some of these places start to feel riskier to invest in that the liquidity has a higher chance of drying up quickly. So that's something that we're also taking into account. It's not just thinking about credit risk, it's not just thinking about pricing, but also thinking about liquidity with some of these communities, and if there might be options out there for the federal government or others to step in to provide some sort of backstop or liquidity facility or something that could help these communities not run into some of these issues that we're not seeing yet, but I think we could see at some time, over the next 5 or 10 years.
Excellent, Emily. Well, each one of you have already started to highlight some of those key steps that we can do at every level, federal, local, private sector, public sector, to drive better decision-making in communities. But I'd really like to focus on what we as a resilience community, what you from your personal perspective and the organizations that you represent, what do we need to be doing not only to help incentivize communities to do the right thing, making sure that they are accurately identifying risk, but taking that next step to actually effectuate good resilience planning, good project implementation. So Dr. Kuski, I'd really like to start with you because you've done so much great work on kind of the perverse moral incentives that we all have created in this country that drive bad behavior. So what do we need to do to shift this conversation to really drive the right behavior? What resources need to be available? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a tough question, right? There's often a real gap between what we think we'd like to be seeing on the ground and what actually is happening. I think as the focus of this entire event today highlights, we really have to begin with assessments of the risks for the particular community, right? They're going to vary a lot, and which ones of those risks have which types of social and economic impacts. I think one of the big challenges too is that with climate, there's not just some new level to design to, and then we've solved adaptation. So it's not as simple as like, oh, just build to this new thing. We're going to be in this environment of constant change. And I think that really requires a different mindset for everyone, for citizens and decision makers. And I think it often means sort of framing or reframing the way we even make decisions in the first place. And so there's been a lot of work in the research community on things like decision-making that's focused on robustness, like not choosing the best outcome, but choosing a type of policy approach that we're confident can perform well across many different possible futures. We're not sure exactly when we're going to experience a climate event or how fast some of these impacts are going to start materializing. So let's pick options that will kind of do as good as we can across all that uncertainty and build resilience broadly to a range of possible stresses and shocks that communities might, be facing. I think to be a little bit more specific, some of this really is most important when we're talking about land use, when we're talking about buildings and infrastructure, because those are decisions that are going to be around for decades. And what we do now matters. Like they're going to still be standing in the future, or they won't if we do it poorly, right? And so some nice policies that I've seen, for example, some localities are now not making those decisions unless they're accompanied by a climate impact analysis. And I think sort of forcing that climate consideration into decisions would be a nice way to move forward.
Serena, I'll go over to you because I think Carolyn makes a great point. We will never reach that enough adaptation that has solved all the problem. From your perspective, what do we need to be doing to drive better decision making and prioritization in our communities?
I think I will point to two things: one top down and the other one bottom up. The first is I think a lot of our policy and regulations are very confusing when it comes to what our federal government is incentivizing or disincentivizing us to do. Many states and local entities, when I speak with them, they're very confused about the use of insurance and how it might affect their ability to receive disaster funding from the federal government. I think there's enough research out there that indicates that long-term recovery is not solely paid by federal government, especially after catastrophic events. Local communities are going to be paying for it for a long time. And when it comes to the type of solutions that we are looking for, we need the private sector taking some of the risks so that the recovery can happen quickly and more fully, right? Because the federal government is not looking to make state and local entities whole. So when we ask this question of what can private sector do, I think there needs to be clarity on what that role looks like for private sector to play a role. Can insurance be a partner in building that resilience for governments at the state and local level? And for that, I think there needs to be clarity of language from top down. From bottom up, I think there's, and as reinsurers, we are, of course, looking at more the macro scale, but I think one of the things that is critical to our understanding is the populations that are most impacted by climate change are really need to be at the heart of some of the policy making and the solutions that we come up with. So, for instance, the federal government and the local governments really support the resilience of individuals who are repeatedly left out of the system, who are really struggling to build themselves, to pull themselves out of the small shocks and stressors and the larger shocks and stressors that are going to come because of climate change. And if that's the case, what are the types of solutions that would help reach the populations that are really difficult to reach by the financial services sector? And here's where we really believe governments really bringing private sector solutions in to reach these populations is important, and to figure out how we are not having this conversation around how the poorest in our population end up affording insurance, but figuring out how governments can play a role in reaching these populations so that that affordability will be there in the long term. So there are community-based solutions that Carolyn has done incredible amounts of work in, as well as parametric solutions that Pam, that you raised, where you can figure out how to bring funding available to individuals and local governments quickly, where I think there needs to be priorities where we're thinking about how do we reach these hard to reach populations together. And I think these two types of solutions could really take us far.
Thanks, Serena. Well, and I think you completely echo Dr. Spoonrad's comments first thing in the workshop, that it is this creative partnership, these public-private opportunities and availability for innovation. So having represented a huge part of the financial and insurance industry, I'd like to turn it over to Mark to talk about this from the government perspective. I have so many memories of the first thing when we see a hurricane coming down, we've got to have NOAA there. We've got to see what the projections are so that we're going into a response scenario with as much information as possible. So how is NOAA taking a look at the current situation and driving, I guess, future innovations to truly help communities prioritize risk, start drawing down that risk, and identifying better ways to tackle this problem? Mark?
Thanks, Pam. I try to give two NOAA answers, and then I might editorialize on a wider government component of this. But from NOAA's perspective, one, as we've highlighted, there are basic science ingredients that are needed to understand risk, which is an important piece of understanding exposure and vulnerability, not just the hazard itself. And so filling geographic gaps and filling timescale and variable gaps where we may have research, we may have a paper, we may have a pilot project, that is very different than a nationally available, authoritative, regularly updated statement on where, on a particular variable of what's going to happen, when, and where. And so NOAA is working very hard to advance our skill, both in the research and supercomputing, in order to create those nationally authoritative, consistent statements across a range of environmental variables. So there are basic gaps that need to be filled that NOAA is seeking to do in partnership with other agencies. And also, as we've said a couple times, more data by itself is not actually the barrier to outcomes, right? It's good, it's important to improve the robustness of how we understand these challenges. But that's not actually currently what's stopping us as a nation from being more resilient on the ground. And one of the pieces that NOAA is investing seriously in is looking at all of agency service delivery to include conversations that incorporate translation and relationship building on the ground. We're not just publishing papers in a journal and saying, well, here you go, y'all figure out what this means to you. As I noted, NOAA's mission includes that kind of arm around the shoulder translation on the ground and partnership building. And so NOAA is seeking to expand beyond a few programs who have expertise in that and raise that expertise up to be an expected enterprise level activity. So those are two that I'd highlight. Just real quick on the federal government writ large, there is important work going on to look at resilience holistically, to understand that there are functions and enablers of resilience that underlie any particular stress from an event or chronic change. So if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these are things like human health, a robust economy, social cohesion and connectedness, right? NOAA doesn't lead on all of this by any means, but there is a very serious discussion across the federal government about how each of the existing mandates and missions of different agencies must be better connected to speak to this kind of interconnectedness of realities on the ground. So if NOAA is part of bringing science to bear, that's great, but Health and Human Services, HUD, FEMA, all have very important roles to play. And that the quality of that dialogue and the earnestness with which the agencies are talking to each other about that partnership is better today than it has ever been in the past. And I'm really encouraged by that.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Emily, I want to turn to you because you obviously represent a lot of how the solution can be achieved. So I'm very interested in your perspective. Are communities taking advantage of municipal financing options? Are they aware of some of the creative solutions that can be brought to bear? How can your industry really help drive the prioritization of risk and better decision-making on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, those are great questions. And I would say we're starting to see it and we're seeing it, something that back to the kind of the original question of this talk of like, our local government finances ready? I think when we talk about it, we talk about it as though the entire country is being affected equally, and it's not true, right? There's some places that are at significant risk and some places that are kind of naturally resilient because of their topography and their geography and their water resources. And those communities, you start to really see a lot of disparities between these places and their environmental risks that they're facing. And so we're seeing some places where there's a lot more focus on it, that they're using green bonds or sustainable development goal linked bonds to try to really focus on environmental projects, resiliency projects somewhat. We saw after Hurricane Harvey, we saw Harris County pass a additional tax to focus on flooding. It's often in cases where something has happened, right? That's how we as humans react to things. You need some event to happen to really mobilize people, and it's harder to get them to prepare before we get to something happening. So we are seeing pockets of it, but there's still, I feel like we are still very early in as analysts understanding what it is we need to know, what is enough adaptation and how do we know that enough is being done that we're comfortable with what that community is doing. The largest voice really comes from the bond rating agencies, and we are seeing them ask those questions, which them asking those questions and us as investors asking those questions can sometimes lead to action by those communities because they start to say, well, we don't have a climate action plan. Maybe we need to have one. People are asking us for it, right? So that's part of what we do is try to engage with places and help push that conversation if it's not happening. But there's still, I see a lot with the rating agencies where it's, well, they mentioned they have a plan and that seems to be enough. I just saw, I think a couple of weeks ago, a coastal community that was upgraded. Their bond rating was upgraded from a fairly high rating to an even higher rating. And this was a place that 25% of their property after Superstorm Sandy was destroyed or was damaged. And so clearly climate risk was not being fully taken into account there. It was saying, well, they have enough money in the bank right now, so we think they deserve a higher bond rating. And so it's very much still thinking in the short term and not about over the longer term when the next flooding event comes. I think there's a lot of people banking on FEMA and assuming FEMA will step in and FEMA will be there and FEMA will fix everything, which has been largely the case to date, but there's still a local match that communities have to pay. And there's still just the question of what happens to those communities after, and the individuals who may lose all of their, may lose their homes, may not be able to rebuild, may not have flooding insurance, or we look at Paradise, California, and, I think a very small percentage of people have returned years later. So there's still, municipal bonds are part of the solution, but there still needs to be money to pay them back. So, I think even just the idea of green bonds that gets a lot of talk and a lot of attention is a solution to the problem. But the issue is there still needs to be money to pay it back. And if it's not coming from these local communities, if they're not able to do it, then where's that money coming from? The state government, federal government, is it insurance? Those aren't answers I necessarily have. But I think it's just needs to be one part of the picture and a vehicle that can be used to pay for some of these projects. But with funding sources, in a lot of places, the local community may not have enough to fully repay it. And given how uneven some of this is across the country and the places that will be impacted the most, it's a question for all of us on if that support can come from places that are more naturally resilient and aren't facing some of the same risks, that could help, spread the pain out more evenly.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I'd really like to pivot to some questions from our audience. Like the last panel, I think we could easily talk for hours about some of this great information and the knowledge and experience that you guys bring to the table. So I'm going to stay on a theme that several of you have raised, and that's the theme of equity. So the question we got: due to the geographically based wealth disparities in local government finances, how do we manage the disparity in the ability of local governments to build resilience in their sphere of influence? And how do we shift the conversation to do that? Certainly this administration is very, very concerned about equity. So how do we make sure that we are keeping track of those who are greatest impacted, whether it's due to high risk or high vulnerability because of lack of resources? Serena, I'd actually like to start with you and hear your perspective on this.
Thank you. I actually want to pick up on a point that Emily made. I think from an insurance standpoint, really shifting our understanding of what is insurable is an important conversation to have, right? We think of property as insurable, health is insurable, but are we thinking about tax volatility or budget stability as something that can be insured? Are we thinking about our bond obligations as something that can be insured, especially when it's impacted by natural catastrophes? So I think shifting that dialogue is really important, especially when it comes to this other question that you're asking about equity. Really, when a community thinks about their priorities and their obligations, we often forget those who are impacted by these in a disproportionate way because they often don't have the loudest voice in a community, or perhaps we don't think of the whole economic impact that population can have. So when we start to understand that kind of social impact that climate change can have on certain portions of the population, really expanding this question of what is insurable is so important, because if a community starts to think about the post-disaster impact on a community, the tax revenue loss from businesses that shut down, the obligations around providing rent stability, or obligations around figuring out how to offer health access, as something that they prioritize as a society, that they prioritize as a community. Now you're shifting the conversation around what that post-disaster obligation is. And you're also shifting that community from having this passive aspect of waiting for FEMA to deliver, whether it is within months or 18 months, as in Harvey, post-Harvey, or when it comes to Sandy, years after, Katrina, years after, where, communities are still waiting for funding. So when you shift that conversation, I think from an insurance standpoint, we have a lot more flexibility in empowering communities to respond to those critical needs. I know that there's a question about regional priorities as well, but here we also are empowering communities that takes away some of that disproportionate impacts that communities can feel. Pam, back to you.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. So actually, I think, Dr. Kuski, I'd really like for you to expand on this a little bit more, because you spoke specifically about how do we start budgeting for this risk, and particularly for those communities that are most vulnerable and don't have a lot of resources to start taking this into consideration. How do we make sure that they're getting the resources and the support that they need to prioritize risk and to make better decisions?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question. And I just want to, before I jump into it, echo what Emily said, because I think there's a lot of excitement about innovative financing approaches, which is all absolutely critical and we need them, but it often misses the important underlying point, which she emphasized, which is you have to be able to pay for it still, right? We still need funding. And that's especially true when we're thinking about sort of disadvantaged communities or communities with fewer resources. There's a very large body of research now that really shows that lower income households, lower income communities suffer disproportionate harm from climate-related disaster events. And despite this sort of very robust research finding, almost none, not entirely, but most of our sort of disaster response and recovery programs don't do very much in terms of means testing or differentially assisting those who need help the most. And I think we've just started thinking about what that truly means. Pam, you mentioned, right, that the Biden administration, has really put equity on the agenda. And I think agencies are at the beginning of trying to figure out what it really means to center equity in these programs in a way that hasn't been done before. So I'm very hopeful, but I also think that means it's going to be a bit of a slow process because we have some thinking to do on what that really is. Also, there's some things that agencies are going to be able to do on their own, and FEMA's already taken some really important steps, for example, on this topic, but there's other stuff that's going to need Congress and changes in legislation, and that gets harder. So if we're thinking about the flood insurance program, for example, they're rolling out their new risk rating, which does a lot of important things. And one thing it does is undo sort of a very regressive cross subsidy. And so that's really great that they're making that change on their own. But what we need Congress to do is to actually put together a means-tested assistance program for low-income households who can't afford the cost of flood insurance and yet need flood insurance the most because they're least able to have access to the other types of financial resources for recovery. And I think we're talking about communities, but these types of household level things are also important because to the extent that households can rebuild and get back online faster and business and economic activity can resume, that translates into better community level outcomes too, right? So we kind of need to be thinking about both. And sorry, rambling a little bit. My last thought on this though, is that some of this thinking about how we sort of center equity again is going to have to even abstract away from climate and disaster a bit. So there's now conversations about changing. A lot of our decision making is around frameworks that come from economic efficiency that might not be appropriate all the time and might not center the values that we want, So I'm thinking about like how, there's now discussion about how can we reform cost benefit analysis, which is a required thing for all major regulations, which FEMA mitigation grants have to go through. And yet we know that if your benefits are avoided damages, and that's property damages, there's a bias towards affluent communities. So maybe we don't want to be using that as our metric of how we disperse public funds, right? Maybe we want to use some other measure. And then once you say that, then things get really difficult. But I think it's really good we're starting to have those conversations.
Mark, I know you are omni-focused on this equity issue, and particularly as you're working on resilience across the NOAA enterprise. I really don't think that there's a better organization out there that has so much wonderful engagement at the state and local level. You've got some very good lessons learned there. How are you guys tackling this equity issue, particularly with regard to NOAA's engagement at the community level?
Thanks, Pam. I'll highlight maybe three pieces of a very complicated puzzle. One, as I've said twice already, there is equity of access issues. The fact that every citizen of the U.S. state and territory does not have the same degree of information about climate science. Right, we've heard about food deserts. There are data deserts. And so we need to just fill those in to make sure everyone's starting from an even playing field. The second is related to the power of partnerships and the importance of NOAA takes seriously its mission to support decision-making at the local level. That includes having folks at the table and having a voice in helping to shape both the formation of new products and services that NOAA produces, but also to make sure that we are circling back and building sustainable dialogues of call and response about how are we doing, what is needed, where can we improve. And so that type, again, to hit on NOAA's focus on user engagement is centered in an equity lens to make sure that we are indeed helping to achieve and inform in the ways that we are expecting to. And the third thing I'd note is just to elevate what Carolyn said right there at the end, in that the cost benefit that goes into so much of the federal math, right? At the end of the day, each federal dollar needs to be explained to an OMB examiner or to Congress of why it serves the federal benefit. And so how we make those calculations are critical. And to date, we have typically focused on the cost of physical damage to our built infrastructure and to our human endeavor on the coast, which is necessary but not at all sufficient to look at the actual societal cost to these impacts. And so there are certainly health and human equity issues. There are also environmental equity issues, and that's a place where NOAA is leaning forward also to talk about, well, fine, we want to say that a functioning ecosystem in a given area has a value to the nation. Well, prove it. How do you do the math? And is your math the same as someone else's? And so this is a good example that there are research papers that talk about this, but there are not standardized national processes on how to approach that challenge. And that's an area, again, where NOAA is leaning forward and seeking to help both provide the science, but also the convening power to center those discussions and help us make progress on those fronts.
Thank you, Mark. Well, Emily, we're going to turn to you to bring us home. Because I think you've already talked a lot about how you can use the information and the data, and how the municipal financing industry is just starting to really to include these kind of things in consideration. So I'd love to hear how you guys are looking at risk and with regard to equity, how some of the things that Mark just mentioned might be rolled into identifying risk, and where, as a leader yourself in this ESG space, where you think we need to be driving municipal financing in the future.
It's a lot of questions. Yeah, I mean, I think on the equity side, I don't know that I have much more to add. I think everyone gave a lot of great perspective there. This concept of environmental equity, I think, is really interesting one. And, looking at that, there are these communities that are going to be much harder hit. We certainly see after an event that there are places that bounce back much more quickly, right? And so one of the factors that we look at is, the size of a tax base and the kind of desirability of it. And, after Malibu, California had a significant wildfire, we saw it come back much faster than, Paradise, or than other places that might be more rural or might be lower income. And so it's certainly a factor in all of this. And we assume that the places that have more resources are probably going to hold out longer. They're maybe going to adapt faster and better and be more resilient. And And I think after Sandy is a good example of Superstorm Sandy, where you saw maybe families that had held on to generational cottages or places that their families had had for generations that couldn't rebuild. And then you saw these large houses go in, and they might be second homes or tourist attractions. And so there's equity is certainly a part of it. I think there's a lot of complexity to it. As far as I'm trying to remember your last question, where we're going with local government finance. I don't know if you could restate if you remember it.
Yeah, I'm just interested in, are there changes? Because I feel that you're very much leading the conversation of where we need to be driving the municipal finance conversation. Yeah, so what I would say for our last question, what would you like to see shift in your world to make for better outcomes, as Mark said, on the ground in communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, everything that we're talking about today, having this happening, more at the local level. And there's some places, I've had conversations with some issuers that are so far, like, I just want to thank them for being as advanced as they are and for really, putting some of the utilities in California that are really aggressively trying to transition off fossil fuels. And we have places that have, are thinking through how to store water for 5-6 years so that they have water supply in a drought, and some really sophisticated work that's being done around the country, and then we have other places where it's still difficult to talk about climate change. And, that I think all of us kind of in the finance space or insurance space or can come in and as more neutral parties in a way where you could take the politics out of it and just say, this is about risk. And this is, what are you doing about this risk? This is a risk we're concerned about. What are you doing about it? And so more of those conversations being had, more communities, I think we're getting there, but more communities starting to disclose what they're doing, the adaptation side, so we can all get a better handle on what's happening and what is meaningful to have happen. I think we will be having those conversations the next few years, and I look forward to them, and I hope that we can encourage more of them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much. So what a wonderful conversation. So much more to discuss. I know that there were lots of questions that we weren't able to get to. Just like on the previous panel, I know that all of us welcome the opportunity to engage with any of the participants here to further talk about your questions. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Rocky, and thank you so very much for the opportunity to continue to drive this forward. So hopefully we get better outcomes in the future.
Thanks, Pam. This was a really great discussion. Definitely, we are early days on understanding how climate risk is challenging community finances, but we heard from our speakers about how there needs to be more public-private partnership in order to solve the environmental and equity problem that we are going to be facing.